您刚才在介绍的时候，就是还提到了一个名称叫克拉克斯。克拉克斯是一个什么样的瓷器？而且我们现在还有一种说法，就是说克拉克斯它的原产地究竟在哪里？是在景德镇还是在漳州？克拉克斯它的这种很独特的一种装饰风格，在元朝的青花瓷和这个红绿彩上曾经出现过，但中间后面一直到这个明代晚期也有重新出现在外销瓷上面。那么这是一个什么原因？
Cracked porcelain began to be produced, we believe, at the very end of the reign of Emperor Longqing, but it was mostly produced during the Wanli to the Chongyan reign, and then it stopped when the Ming dynasty collapsed, so the production stopped. So the style of cracked porcelain varies, but the most characteristic type is the panel borders. So the decoration is a central scene, which could be naturalistic or with figures, but then all the ornamental designs are put into different shaped panels. So we have a number of different panels then among the cracked porcelain. Just to show you another one, here you see other types of panels. So the panels can vary enormously from one to the next. So the majority of cracked porcelain was produced in underglazed cobalt blue. Only a few pieces are known with overglazed enamels only. Then a few other pieces I know with underglazed blue and underglazed copper red. But those are extremely rare, very few pieces. So the majority of the pieces are produced in cracked porcelain were made for export. We know that some pieces have been excavated in China, but the majority was produced for the export market. And this included a small quantity produced with coat of arms for different individuals. For example, this piece was produced for Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza and his wife, Teresa de Castro de la Cueva. Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza was the viceroy of Peru from 1596 to 98, I think it was. And so this is the only armorial in cracked porcelain for the Spanish market, but many were made for the Portuguese market with different coat of arms of Portuguese merchants and individuals and travelers. So the production of cracked porcelain was quite varied, not only dishes and plates, but also bowls, bottles, and different kinds of objects. So in relation to the design of organizing the decoration of the rim and cavetto in panels, there's been a lot of discussion. So some people have proposed that they came from the Middle East, other people said maybe Maiolica, but if one studies the porcelain produced in the Yuan dynasty, you already see molded rims, so on the sides with molding and panels. Then in the 1558 shipwreck, the Espadarte, which was a Portuguese shipwreck, the first shipwreck from Portugal found with Chinese porcelain that was coming back from Asia to Lisbon, there are pieces molded and with panels. Simple panels, but panels. So I personally believe that it evolved from the Chinese repertoire of designs, not from Iran, not from Europe. The motifs that they use, mostly based in nature of cracked porcelain, but it also included some figure scenes that were based on Chinese stories, and these would have been very attractive for Europe to see these beautifully painted scenes, which they would have considered very exotic. So it was very well received, and then it was copied all over Europe and also in the Americas. So we have copies of Chinese cracked porcelain in Portugal, in the Netherlands, and in the Americas you have in Mexico, you have in Peru, you have in many different places. Of course they copied in their own earthenware, not because they did not have porcelain, did not exist. But this is the appreciation of cracked porcelain, that it was made in local products for the people of the lower classes. An important fact, historical fact, of the initial production of cracked porcelain is that Emperor Longqing lifted the ban on international trade, coinciding exactly in the same timing that the Spanish began to trade to the Americas and ordered huge amount of pieces. If one considers 22,300 pieces in the late 16th century, is an enormous quantity to be shipped. So I think the Jingdezhen potters adapted their production methods and created these porcelains. First of all, the small size porcelains were very thin, so they economized in materials, and then the fact that they were molded with panels facilitated the work of the painters to decorate after the pieces. It was much easier to decorate within panels, smaller panels on the borders. So these, I think, the Spanish helped to develop cracked porcelain. This is my personal view, because the potters needed to adapt to this new demand of enormous quantities, and this method of producing them facilitated this production. The panels, I think it's mainly from China. They were, it's true, they were also made in fruitware in the Middle East, pieces that also had panels. But having your own porcelain from the Yuan dynasty with panels, why you should copy? Of course, many of the Yuan dynasty porcelains were made for the Middle Eastern market, and maybe that was a taste that it was developed in the Middle East. But I think probably the potters look at they had produced before, not what they were producing overseas.
其实呢，我们说这个瓷器哈，它还承载着两类的信息，一类是关于技术的，手工艺这一块，另一类信息是文化的。它带着技术信息到欧洲以后，欧洲人开始仿做瓷器。那么它的文化因素进了欧洲以后，尤其在16到18世纪，进入欧洲的各国的王室或者一些贵族的上流社会的一些家庭，进而它对于欧洲的一些社会时尚、审美情趣，包括一些餐桌上的礼仪，都产生了很多的影响。Teresa女士能不能跟我们介绍一下这些在欧洲国家，他们对这个瓷器的这个欣赏和使用的一些基本情况，包括使用的一些场景，然后它的有什么样的文化意义、历史意义？
Before I do that, I just want to clarify, because I didn't answer one part of the question before, is that cracked porcelain was produced in Jingdezhen. There were imitations produced at the Jiangzhou kilns in Fujian province, but these should not be called crack, because the material qualities of the porcelain are much thicker, the designs are much simpler, but they imitate the organizations and the designs. So this should be said that Jiangzhou porcelains, they are in the style of cracked porcelain, but they are not cracked porcelain. So that's an important point to make, because the majority of the Jiangzhou porcelain was intended for the Southeast Asian market. So they wanted to compete with Jingdezhen and make porcelain in this style that was very, very popular around the world, mostly for the Southeast Asian and Japanese market. In terms of the uses and appreciation of the porcelain when it arrived to Europe, so the first people to import in considerable quantities were the Portuguese. So, but before the Portuguese, a small quantity, as I mentioned to you, of Chinese ceramics and in monochrome glazes, so stonewares and later on porcelains, arrived to Europe from the 9th to the 14th century, but only in very small quantities. And these pieces arrived for now what we know, first to Spain and to Italy. And these pieces were highly valued by the Europeans. They were generally mounted with very costly metal mounts of silver gilt or gold itself, or silver, and they were used for display. They did not have a practical use. When the Portuguese came into the picture and brought more quantities of pieces, the royalty and clergy and aristocracy of Portugal particularly, and also of Spain and other royal courts, because they were all related by marriage, began to use it as tableware, so to eat with it in formal dinners, and also as decoration in their palaces or in the places where they live. From the middle of the 16th century, we know through documents that the aristocracy of different places, first in Portugal, then in England and in Spain and in Italy, they began to collect a considerable group of pieces, 150, 300 something, in a particular space in the household where they will probably display it, because they call them Casa das Porcelanas, so the porcelain room. So we don't know exactly how they were displayed or how many of them they were displayed, but they were kept in these special places. And that begins the fashion of collecting a number of pieces in the middle of the 16th century. And in the 1630s, this fashion spread to the Netherlands, and for example, Amalia van Solms, she had created a cabinet where she displayed the porcelain in different types of furniture, our consoles, and the mantle of the chimney. So this fashion is spread around Europe from the 1630s onwards. And this ended up in the huge cabinets of, for example, Augustus the Strong in Germany, in Dresden. So enormous quantities of porcelain being displayed in one room. We have Charlottersburg in Berlin, for example, that is incredible in the Baroque style. You have walls with gold lacquer and mirrors and enormous quantities of porcelain, not only blue and white, the majority blue and white, but also in Imari style and in overglazed enamels. The appreciation of porcelain initially not only gave the persons, the kings, princes, aristocracy, reflected their high social status and their power, but also demonstrated to others that they had a universal knowledge of the world. So they knew about China, because we must remember that in the Renaissance, very few people in Europe knew about China, and they thought it was a distant and enigmatic country because they did not have much information about it.
也就是说，一般的老百姓用不到这些瓷器的。
Not at the beginning. They began to have more access after the Dutch began to import some millions of pieces, and then you see that the lower classes imitating the way that the aristocracy and royalty display their porcelain, and they began to display, as I told you, for example, in their household. They will have pieces arranged symmetrically on top of furniture, or the chimney mantle, or the lintels of the door. And in the Netherlands, the houses did not have curtains. So people would actually see what the person had inside. So that's why these displays of the middle classes, the bourgeois, would show to others that they have access to these pieces.